Hey kids, so I wanted to create this video for those of you who are really struggling with verbs. Now, there seems to be a lot of confusion and uncertainty, like this feeling of, I'm not sure if I'm answering this question correctly when answering verb questions on the digital SAT. And it's very understandable because there are so many things that you have to know and keep track of with verbs. So for example, you have to know which verb tense to use at times. Do you use the past perfect tense or the present perfect tense? Or do you use the simple tenses, like the simple past, present, or future? And how do you even tell? Right? You also have to know about verb forms. So when do you use the ing present participle form? Or how do you know when to choose between a past tense form, right, and the past participle form? To add to this extra layer of chaos and confusion, you have to be able to decide at times when to use a singular or a plural verb. Now, in order to do that successfully, you have to be able to successfully identify what's called the simple subject in an independent clause, which is hard for a lot of students to do because a lot of the students that I've worked with have never learned what these terms are. So if you fall into one of these categories of students and you just feel like, man, these questions are hard, and you lack a lot of confidence when working through these questions, you're going to want to stick around throughout this entire video because this video will provide you guys with an excellent overview of everything you need to know about verbs and how they're tested on the digital SAT. Now, in future videos, I'll go more in depth on each of these concepts that I hit on in this video, but this video is just providing you guys with a foundational knowledge to give you guys a rock solid base, right, of the things that you need to know and the things that you'll encounter with verbs on the SAT. So I'll see you guys soon in the lab. All right, welcome to the lab. So guys, I wanted to make sure that you were paying full attention to the information that's written in these slides and the things that you hear me talk about and explain. You know, the content is by far the single most important thing that's going to help you guys increase your scores. So seeing my face in these videos is not going to boost your scores by 100 points, but the ideas, the information, the ways of thinking, the processes, the tips, the knowledge that I do pass on, those are the things that if you really take the time to internalize them and self-study, I guarantee you'll see a nice little boost to your score. At the very least, you're going to start to feel more confident. You're going to start to feel this test becoming easier based off of the ideas and the things that I share. So my goal with this video and for each and every one of you is to make sure that you all have a very rock solid base. What I mean by that is I want to make sure that each of you has a very clear and comprehensive understanding of all of the basic things that you need to know about verbs and the digital SAT. So the way that I'll do that is by first sharing with you guys what I call foundational knowledge. Foundational knowledge is just a fancy way of saying the basic stuff that you need to know about how the SAT tests you on verbs. So for example, there's 3 different ways that the SAT will test you on verbs. I'll also talk about context clues. You know, this is just basically the surrounding text, right? The text that's surrounding the underlined blank in the passage. What type of context, what type of information you need to be on the lookout for and identify when dealing with a particular verb question. Right? And I'll talk about the processes of how to answer these questions from start to finish. I'll also share with you guys some practical tips and tools and strategies that I use personally and that a lot of my top scoring students have adopted and used themselves to get almost every single verb question correct, right? With confidence and with certainty. And the way that we'll do this is through examples that I found on the practice tests that College Board released and that you guys can download on their website. So if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Jin Bei, but most of my kids just call me Jin Teacher, and you guys can call me that too. I'm a top 1% scorer on the verbal sections of the SAT, the ACT, and the GMAT exams. I have over 14 years of experience working in one of the most academically competitive cities in the world called Seoul, South Korea. And I'm just grateful, I'm blessed, I'm blown away. I'm just really humbled by the fact that I've been recognized as a top test prep instructor for the majority of my career and time out there. I'm also an author and a content creator of standardized tests like the SAT and ACT. So I have a contract with the Korean publishing company to publish and release a practice test book for the digital SAT verbal section, right? The reading and writing questions. And that's going to be released before the end of the year. I'm also, what I mean by being a content creator is I've created literally over thousands of practice questions for the SAT and the ACT exam. And all of these questions are based off of my observations of tens of thousands of questions that I've used to study with, to prepare and take the actual exams with, and the stuff that I use to teach my students with. So I do have a lot of experience when it comes to, tests, and I do kind of know the patterns, right, that the SAT and the ACT kind of present you guys with, just because I've been doing it for a really long time. And so that's what I want to share with you guys, right, in this video and for all future videos. In fact, you guys, one of the reasons that I started creating videos on social media platforms like YouTube is really part of an experiment. It's really something that I was curious about. So let me explain. So my goal for every single student that I work with is to help them miss fewer than 5 questions consistently. Now the key word is consistently, right? And I define consistently as at least 5 tests in a row. So no matter how hard or how easy that particular test is, you're still able to get fewer than 5 questions wrong, right? So that is my number one priority. It's really a mission that I'm on, or that I have for every single student that I work with for at least 2 months. And it's with that sort of mindset, right, that I'm going to be talking to you guys about in these videos. So I'm not going to hold anything back. I'm not going to hold any secrets or any insights or information. I'm going to share all of that with you guys, right? And, that's really part of the experiment. Like, I really wanted to see if I could help you guys with these videos, right, achieve scores that were similar to the scores that I saw in my students that I worked with, right, in person in real time. Just to give you guys a fun little statistic, over 80% of my students score in at least the 90th percentile, as long as I work with them for over 2 months. And I had hundreds of students score in that 99th percentile for the SAT and the ACT exams. So I know it's extremely possible, and I have this very firm and deeply rooted belief that every single one of you guys can do it. And the reason that I know that, not just think it, but I know it, is because I've helped so many different types of students. So I work with international students, and international students, basically that means that English isn't your first language, right? And so if I'm able to help these guys achieve, at least 90th percentile scores within a short period of time, like, I know I can do that, right? Like, I just believe that I can do that for millions of people, through social media, content like YouTube. And the other thing that I wanted to test out or experiment was being able to provide this kind of information for free. I know that a lot of you guys are really starving for, top quality resources, whether it's instructors or questions or things like that. I know that a lot of you guys are either geographically or financially, right, unable to access, right, top quality resources. So I wanted to see if, I could help those of you who need the help but can't really, find it for various reasons. And I know that if you guys just stick with me, continue to watch these videos, I know that you guys will see massive improvements to your score. And you'll also start to feel like you're learning. You'll start to feel like you're gaining more confidence. You'll start to feel like you're gaining more certainty when answering these questions. Like, that's something that I can guarantee you guys if you just stick with me. All I really need from students to help them improve their scores is just two things. Like, I need you guys to want to get better, right? Like, in other words, I can't want it for you. I do want it for you. Like, I want each and every one of you guys to experience like top tier scores, right? 95th, 98th, 99th percentile scores. I sincerely do, but my desire for you to achieve those scores, right, isn't enough, right? You're gonna have to want it for yourselves, right? So as long as you guys are interested, as long as you guys want to get better, and as long as you guys try, those are the two things that I need from you guys, right? Effort, which is just giving me your attention and focus, self-studying, right? Asking me questions in the comments, right? Continuing to watch these videos, taking practice tests on your own, just trying these things out for yourself sincerely and seriously. And if you guys have those two things, I guarantee you your scores will increase. My goal is to upload a video like this daily, and so be on the lookout for that. Okay. Also, write in the comments anything that you're confused about or have questions around, and I'll read all of the messages and I'll respond to you guys either as a response in the comment section, or I'll create a video around it if there's a lot of you guys who kind of are curious about the same thing. Okay, so with that being said, you guys, let's jump into this. Let's jump into today's lesson. So before we get started, I do have to mention that although I have a sort of general structure and a format for these videos, I don't script anything out. So this is me talking in real time as if I were teaching just one of you guys one-on-one, or if I were teaching in a classroom. So that's why my voice isn't going to be my explanations won't always be as crystal clear. Sometimes I take roundabout ways. That's just something that you're going to have to bear with me on. And that's just how I teach anyways. And it's still very effective for the students who just pay attention. Also, I don't have the nicest handwriting in the world, you guys. And it's something that used to give me a lot of shame and embarrassment about. I used to feel really embarrassed about my handwriting, but I've made peace with it. And I hope you guys can make peace with it too. So with that being said, let's talk about today's lesson. So guys, the very first thing that you need to know about verbs on the SAT is that there are three main ways that you'll be tested on verbs on the SAT. Okay, now the way that I want you to think about this is as a mental hierarchy. So I want you to think about this in this order. Okay, so I'll present those three ways for you guys right now. So the first way that verbs are tested on the SAT is what's called subject-verb agreement. So this concept is very straightforward. This just means that a singular verb must take a singular subject. And the plural verb, right, must take a plural subject, right? So as a very basic example, if you have a singular subject like he has to take a singular verb, right? So you have to say he runs, right? You can't say he run, right? Or if you have a plural subject like they or the boys, right? You have to have a plural verb to match, right? So this concept is very basic, is very simple and straightforward. It just basically means that the subject and the verb have to agree in number, right? So singular verbs with singular subjects, plural verbs with plural subjects. Okay. The second way that the SAT can test you on verbs is what's called verb forms. So verb forms, you guys, if you circle that word forms, verb form just basically means how the verb is formed. Like, how is it written, right? So how do you write, like, the past tense of to run, right? That's going to be ran, right? How do you write the past participle, right? That's going to be had run, right? Present participles like I running, right? Like with the ing. So you're going to see different forms of the verb, right, in your answer choices. You might see the infinitive form, which is like the to plus the base verb, right? Like to be, to have, to want, so on and so forth. You might see the present participle, like the ing form. You might see verb like tenses as well, right, as forms. So you might see a present tense, like runs, or the past tense, right, like ran. And when you have a verb form question on the SAT, you're most likely going to be dealing with sentence structure, right? With sentence structure. And that makes a lot of sense because the way that a verb is formed can affect the structure of the sentence, right? So for example, if I say, Jack running home, like, that this is not a complete sentence, right? So we have an error to the sentence structure, right? We have what's called a fragment, right? So we have to have the correct form of the verb, right, to create a grammatical sentence structure, right? So we'd have to say like Jack ran home or Jack runs home, right? That's what verb forms is about. And the third way that the SAT can test you on verbs is verb tenses. Okay, so verb tenses is what it sounds like, right? You have different tenses in the English language. There's actually 11 verb tenses in the English language, but you don't need to know all 11. You just really need to know, you have to have a very solid understanding of just 5. You have to know the present tense, the past tense, the future tense, the past perfect, and the present perfect tenses. And you have to know when to use which tense, right? And so that's what this concept is testing you on. Now, when I said at the top of this slide that I want you to think about this as a mental hierarchy, what I mean is when you identify the question as testing you on verbs, I want you to think about what way is this question testing me on verbs? Is it testing me on verbs in the way of subject-verb agreement, right? Or verb forms, or verb tenses? Okay, and think about subject-verb agreement first. And the reason for this is subject-verb agreement is not only the most common and most frequently tested verb concept on the SAT, but also verb tenses. This is the verb concept that confuses a lot of students. So most students will think about verb tenses first. And when you do that, a lot of times you're going to make mistakes, right? For one, verb tenses are the hardest to kind of figure out because the context clues aren't as obvious as some of these other verb concepts. And students just tend to have a harder time with verb tenses, right, than any other concept of verbs that are tested on this test. So the great thing about this mental hierarchy, guys, is sometimes you don't even have to consider verb forms or verb tenses to get the question correct, right? Because your understanding of this question testing you on subject-verb agreement as one of the ways this question can be testing you on verbs is going to be enough for you to answer the question correctly, okay? Also, it's important to know that the SAT can test you on more than one verb concept for a single question. Okay, and that's typically when the level of difficulty of that question will get harder. Yeah, so we'll talk about how to work through that, right, as well. Okay, but these are the 3 basic ways, and what I want to show you guys next is just some examples from the practice exams that College Board released. So these are actual test questions created by the actual test makers, right? And so that's what the slide that you see here is. So before we jump into this passage, you guys, I want you guys to take a look at how I formatted it, okay? So here you're gonna see CB Practice Test 1, Modules 2, right? And I highlighted the word writing because this is a writing question, right? So the 6 practice exams that are on the College Board website, um, you know that like there's 33 questions per module, and you know that the reading questions make up the first half of the test and the writing questions make up the second half, right? So just wanted to kind of label to help you guys identify, right, that you're dealing with a writing question, like a grammar question, instead of like a reading comprehension style question. Okay, and for those of you guys who want to actually work through these questions on your own, you'll know where to find it, right? It'll be practice test number 1, the second module, question number 19. Okay, I've also gone a step further and labeled the specific concept that this question is testing you on. So it's not just testing you on standard English conventions, because that language is too broad. It's too general, right? What does that mean? Standard English conventions just means like this is the way that the English language is used, right? Conventionally, like traditionally. But that's such a broad way to categorize the question that you want to make it more narrow and specific, right? The more precisely you're able to identify what you're being tested on, right, the more specifically the strategies you can employ to answer these questions correctly. Okay, so this specific, concept from the category of standard English conventions is subject-verb agreement. So you'll see that here. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to all of you guys. It should be, at least. Okay, so if we take a look at this passage, you guys. Oh, before we jump into the passage itself, I want to share with you guys a general test-taking tip. Okay, so when it comes to grammar questions, so for every grammar question except for transition questions and rhetorical synthesis. So transition questions are where you have answer choices with like transition words, right? Like however, furthermore, for example, etc. And then rhetorical synthesis questions are the questions at the very end of the module that have the bullet pointed notes and then the goal the student wants, right? Like the student wants to emphasize whatever, right? The differences between so on and so forth. So for every single grammar question except those 2, the transition and rhetorical synthesis questions, I approach the passage the same way. So when I'm reading the passage, and I want you guys to do this as well. Okay, this is just a very practical test-taking strategy, is when you're reading the passage, you guys, don't just skip the underlined blank, right? And then read the word after it, because it's not going to make a lot of sense a lot of the times, right? So instead, just plug in answer choice A. Just plug this in, right? Pretend that the word were, right, was in place of the underlined blank. Okay, so even if it's wrong, it's okay. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is make sure that you read to the end of the sentence and just make observations, right? Read to the end of the sentence and you're just making observations. Okay, so a lot of students, what they do, and this is a mistake, is they stop in the middle of the sentence and they try to solve the question right there, right? And that's a huge mistake, because the SAT test makers know this. And what they do is they actually place important details after the underlined blank, sometimes in that sentence, right? Or sometimes even in the sentence afterwards, right? That are really important to help you get the question correct. So if you're not reading to the end of the sentence and just making observations, right, you're oftentimes going to be very confused and you're going to choose the incorrect answer. Okay, so make sure that you read to the end of the sentence and just make observations. So what do I mean by observations? Well, that's pretty broad. But there could be many different things about observations, especially for grammar questions, right? So one of the things that I observe is the sentence structure. So do I have an independent clause, right? Do I have a run-on sentence? These are some of the things that are going through my head as I'm reading the first time through to the end of the sentence. Another observation that I make is I make note of punctuation, right? I might make note of what the subject is, right? The award-winning book, and what the verb is, right? And these are just certain things that I observe is all. Okay, so when you're reading for grammar, It's different than when you're reading for like a reading comprehension question. For a reading comprehension question, you're really reading to understand the main ideas, right? Like you're trying to understand what the heck the writer is talking about. But when you're reading grammatically, you're not focused as much on what the author is talking about, although you do want to try to understand what's being said, right? You do need to understand what the heck you're reading, but that shouldn't be your main focus, right? Your main focus should really be about sentence structure, about grammar, right? About punctuation, because that's what you're going to be tested on. Okay, so those are some two very practical tips for just general tips, right, for grammar questions. All right, now the next tip that I can share with you guys here is, well, how do you tell, right? How do you tell what verb concept you're being tested on? So guys, when you see a question pop up, when it's a grammar question, don't immediately start to read the passage. Okay, don't just jump in to read and say, when writing the other black girl. Instead of doing that, I want you guys to take a look at the answer choices. Just glance at it, right? Just kind of take a sort of holistic view, right? A general overview of the answer choices. Okay, now we can obviously see, so the answer choices and the way that they're formed can give you a really great clue as to what specific concept the SAT is testing you on. Right? So if we just take an overview of these answer choices, we can tell we're being tested on verbs, right? But I don't want to stop there. And I don't want you guys to as well. So we talked about this mental hierarchy, right? So you know that there's 3 different ways that the SAT tests you on verbs. Do you remember what they are? Right? The first way is subject-verb agreement. Second way is verb forms, which really deals with like sentence structure and parallel structure. And the third way is with verb tenses. And I want you to think about that in that order. Okay, so how do you think about subject-verb agreement, right, when you identify a verb question that you're being tested on? Well, the way that you check for whether you're being tested on subject-verb agreement is you take a look at and try to notice any differences between singular and plural verbs, right? So you'll be able to tell when we go through a couple of these questions, you'll be able to kind of notice the differences in the answer choices, the slight differences for different types of verb concepts that you're going to be tested on. Okay, so if you look at A, you guys were, right, this is going to be a plural verb, right? And if we take a look at answer choice C, has been, right, we take a look at that first word, has, and we know that has is singular, right? Because we would say he has, not they has. Right? So as soon as you notice that difference between a plural and a singular verb, boom, you know that one of the concepts they're going to test you on is subject-verb agreement. Okay? Just to be kind of clear and thorough, answer choice B, have been, is a plural verb, and are is also a plural verb. Okay? But we don't have to think about verb tenses right now. Okay, so don't even think about like past tense or present tense, right? We're just looking at the difference between singular and plural verbs. Okay, now with that knowledge, right, you know that to find the correct answer, you have to be able to identify, right, the subject of the sentence. Okay, and now this is where in my next video, I'll break this down in much more detail and in a more structured way. But here you're going to have to be able to identify what's called the simple subject from the complete subject, right? And we'll talk about that in the next video in much more detail. But if we read the sentence, and just to save time, I'll just read from the award-winning book, right? But if I'm actually taking the test, of course, I'm reading from the beginning. Okay, but you don't want to read, remember you guys, you don't want to read before you take a glance at the answer choices. Like taking a glance at the answer choices first, and you're being able to identify, oh, they're testing me on subject-verb agreement, is going to help you guys so much to read more effectively. Because now when I'm reading the passage or when I'm reading the sentence with the underlined portion in it, I'm observing what the subject is. Like that's my primary focus. Right? Do I care what the main idea of the sentence is or what the main purpose of the passage is? No way. Because that information isn't going to help me. It's not relevant to answer this question successfully. Does that make sense? Cool. So when I read the sentence, it says, the award-winning book, right? So this is the subject of the independent clause. And we know the subject is singular, right? Because it's the award-winning book, right? Book refers to just one. It's a singular, not a plural. Plural would be books, right? So we have a singular subject and we have a singular verb. The award-winning book is Harris's first novel, comma, but her writing were honored before. Okay, so what I notice here is I notice that this verb, right, were, I have to be able to identify the subject of this verb. So the way that you can do that is you can ask yourself, like, what was honored, right? What was honored? And if you read again from the beginning of the sentence, you'll be able to tell that it's her writing, right? Her writing is what was honored, right? And her writing, we know that her writing is singular, right? This is a singular subject. Singular, for those of you guys who don't know, singular just refers to one, right? Like a subject is like any noun, like a person, place, thing, an object, an idea, right? Like love or responsibility, and singular subjects just refers to like one, right? And plural subject refers to more than one. So the way that you would write that is, normally when you have a plural subject, you just add an S to it, right? So if I say book, that's a singular subject, but if I say books, that's a plural subject, right? So I know that this is a singular subject, so I know that the verb also has to be singular, right? So because of that, I know that were is going to be wrong, because were is plural, have been is wrong, and are is wrong. So immediately, I know that C is going to be the correct answer, because it's the only verb that works, right? So without even having to think about, right, the verb tense, this is called the present perfect tense, but without even having to think about it, right? Like, how do you use the present perfect tense? What's the difference between the present perfect and the past tense, or the present perfect and the present tense, right? That's hard to think about, right? But if you can just identify that, hey, a couple of these answers are plural verbs, and then there's a difference between those, and then this other answer choice, which is a singular verb, right? So if you think in that mental hierarchy, and you work through the question based on your understanding of what specific concept they're testing you on for this question, right? You'll read in a much more focused and very purposeful type of way, okay? So that would be how you would work through, right, this sort of subject-verb agreement question. Now, I put a couple on here just to show you guys like some similarities, right? And also a little bit of differences too. And so this should just give me a little bit more to talk about. By the way, this question here, number 19, is an easy question. And the reason why this question is easy is because the subject, writing, is placed right next to the verb, right? The writing has been. Her writing has been. It's right next to each other. So it's really, really easy to identify what the subject of the sentence is, of this verb is. Okay, but that's not always going to be the case. So one of the ways that the SAT makes subject-verb agreements a little bit more challenging is that they make the verb they separate the verb from the subject, right? So they put the verb far away from the subject by placing what are called like modifiers, or even like non-essential information between your subject and your verb, right? So sometimes you might see commas, right, between your subject and your verb. Other times you might see like prepositional phrases, right? Like if I say the list of books, right, in my house, of books in my house, that's a modifier. It's a prepositional phrase, right? Because it begins with a preposition. Well, if you guys aren't familiar with these concepts, don't worry about them. I will explain them in much more detail in future videos. But I just want you guys to see that how the SAT can make this type of question a little bit more challenging for you. Okay. So really the subject of this example here, the list of books in my house, is the list, right? And the list is a singular subject, right? But can you see how if you think that books is your subject, right, you might get this question incorrectly, right? So it's just another level of difficulty that the SAT test makers will utilize, right, to try to make the test a little bit more challenging for you. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that in this particular question. But if we work through this question systematically, right, in the way that I taught you guys, do we read the passage first or do we look at the answer choices first? We look at the answer choices first, right? So what do we look for? We want to use that mental hierarchy, right? We can tell that we're being tested on verbs, right? Everyone can see that very quickly. It doesn't take a rocket scientist and it doesn't take much time to identify you're being tested on verbs. Now from there, go through your mental checklist, right? Look for differences between singular and plural verbs, right? And do you know that if you see a difference, it's okay if just you have a difference between two answer choices. One of them is plural, one of them is singular. That's enough for you to know that subject-verb agreement is one of the things you're being tested on. It might not be the only thing, but at least it gives you a starting point, right? So you can see that here. Answer choice A, allows, is a singular verb, right? Because you would say it allows, or he allows, or she allows. You wouldn't say they allows, right? And you know that D here is a plural verb because you would say they allow, right? You don't say they allows, right? So we have to make sure that our subject matches with our verb, right? And we have to be able to identify when we have a singular or a plural verb. If we look at B, don't focus on the ing, right? Focus on the verb that comes before that, right? The helping verb called are, right? So are is a plural verb. So we know that this answer choice is a plural verb. Answer choice C, have, is also plural too, right? So we notice that A is the only one that's singular and the other three are plural verbs. So we have this difference between between singular and plural verbs. So now what we do is we read the passage, right? We read the passage and what are we focused on? We're focused on identifying the subject of that verb, right? So in other words, what allows a person to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal? That's what we're focused on finding, okay? So I'm gonna start from the second sentence here. It says, in both games, players encounter good or bad spaces while traveling along a path. Landing on one of the good spaces allows a player to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal. Okay, remember to read to the end of the sentence and just make observations. So one of the things that I observe is this semicolon, right? And we'll talk about punctuation rules in more detail in future videos, but the punctuation rule that you have to know for a semicolon is that it separates two independent clauses, right? So I know I have an independent clause before the semicolon and I have an independent clause after the semicolon. Because this underlying portion is part of the second independent clause, right, the one after the semicolon, I can focus on that, right? And I can look for and I try to identify the subject, right? So when I'm reading here, landing on one of the good spaces allows, right? So this entire thing, landing on one of the good spaces, is your subject. Okay, this is what's known as the complete subject. And I'll talk about this in a much more organized and structured way in the next video. But this is what's known as your complete subject. Your complete subject is just the entire group of words that make up the subject of the sentence, right? So the complete subject will include modifiers, you know, like prepositional phrases, relative clauses, you know, things like that, right? And you also have to be able to identify, right, what's called your simple subject. Okay, so your simple subject is, you know, typically it's that one word, right? It's that word that comes before all of the additional information stuff, right? The modifiers. You know, it's the word, it's the noun that comes after adjectives and before like prepositional phrases, non-essential information, and things like that. Okay, so in this particular example, the simple subject is landing. Why? How do I know that? Well, because I notice when I read landing on, I notice a preposition here, right? On is a preposition, right? Prepositions are usually like direction and location words. They're really like the small little words that kind of connect information, right? They make the sentences more detailed and specific, you know, and a prepositional phrase is a group of words that begins with the preposition and ends with the noun, right? So if I say on one of the good spaces, this is a prepositional phrase, right? Begins with the preposition on, right? one of the good spaces and ends with the noun spaces. Okay? Well, it's important to identify prepositional phrases because grammatically, you cannot have the main subject of a sentence inside of a prepositional phrase. So you ignore that, right? This is why the simple subject is the word that comes before prepositional phrases and other types of modifiers, right? So landing is your subject here. And we know that landing is a singular subject, right? And if you guys didn't know that, this is a great grammar rule to write down. ing words, you guys, can sometimes be used as the subject of a sentence, right? So if I say swimming is my favorite sport, right? Swimming is the subject, right? And the verb is. And so the grammar rule here is ing words, when they're used as subjects, they're always singular. It's always singular. Okay, so I have a singular subject here, and I have to make sure that a singular subject agrees with a singular verb, right? So the singular verb here is, the only answer that works here is going to be A. And again, that's because are, have, and allow are all plural verbs, right? So again, I don't have to even consider the form of the verb or the tense of the verb to get this question correct, right? So this is what's called systematic thinking. It's just a very organized, sort of step-by-step way of thinking, right? And it's this type of stuff that you guys need to establish as foundational knowledge, right, to be able to execute when you're under time pressure, okay, on this test, okay? And so there's a couple other things that I want to share with you guys, but this video is already going pretty long. It's already about 40 minutes long, so I'll jump over to the next way that verbs can be tested on the SAT, and this is going to be verb forms. Okay, so our general process of reading the passage or approaching this question is the same, right? For all grammar questions except for transition and rhetorical synthesis, we take a glance at the answer choices, right? And notice how, you guys, the answer choices here in this verb question that's testing you on verb forms, not subject-verb agreement, how these answer choices look different from the ones that test you on subject-verb agreement, right? Notice how we have ing. That's a really big clue for me, right? Like having claimed or claiming, right? Or we have like the infinitive, right? To claim. So these are different ways that verbs can be written or formed, right? And you notice that, right, as the signal, right, that you're being tested on verb forms, or at least one of the concepts you're being tested on for verbs is verb forms for this particular question. Okay, like I said before, sometimes for the harder questions, you'll be tested on more than one grammar concept, right, for one question. Sometimes you might be tested on two. Usually it's two, but I've seen some questions, the hardest types of questions, test you on like 3. In those cases, the strategy is very simple. It's always just to focus on one concept at a time, okay? But the thing is, when you're doing this initial kind of glance at the answer choices, don't worry about, right, figuring out all of the ways that they're testing you on verbs here, okay? It's not possible. But you'll start to kind of be able to identify just generally, right, the main concept they're testing you on, okay? And it's based on how the answer choices are kind of formed, right? So if you take a look at the answer choices in the previous question number 26 in module 1, the one that's testing you on subject-verb agreement, notice how we have like singular and plural, right? But then for this, look at these answer choices. Don't they kind of look different, right? Doesn't this set of answer choices look kind of different from the previous set, right? And doesn't this set of answer choices look kind of similar to this one here? In terms of like the has and, or the were and are and has and have, right? Especially the has and have, right? Or the allows and allow, right? Those look very similar to each other, right? Versus the set of answer choices here look kind of different, especially when you have like just claiming by itself or like to claim, right? These are the different sort of indicators, right, that you're going to be tested on verb form specifically, okay? So when we're being tested on verb forms, right, one of the things that you want to focus on when you're reading is the sentence structure, right? And again, sentence structure, you guys, is nothing more than just how the sentence is built, right? Like how it's structured, right? And you want to make sure that every sentence that you read on the SAT has at least one independent clause in it. Right? If you're not sure what an independent clause is just a complete sentence, right? We'll talk more about that concept in a future video, but I'll show you guys what that looks like here. Okay, so I'll just start from the second sentence here. So it says, some historians claiming that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, which occurs when investors drive prices to highs not supported by actual demand. Right? So make sure to read to the end of the sentence and just make observations, right? So when I'm reading for sentence structure, which is one of the things that I consider almost always when I read and answer a grammar question, I'm really checking to see if I'm really trying to identify what the independent clause is, and I'm trying to identify the other parts of a sentence, right? These are like other parts of the sentence could be things like non-essential phrases. They could be relative clauses, right? They could just be extra additional pieces of information that make the sentence more complicated or complex, right? So instead of just having one simple sentence like Jack runs fast, right? Making it a little bit more complex by adding other parts, right, of a sentence, you can make the sentence more complex. You could say something like, during the morning of races, Jack, comma, a two-time high school athlete, comma, runs fast. Something like that, right? So it just makes it more complicated of a sentence is all. Okay, so that's the stuff that I'm kind of checking for, right? And so what that looks like concretely in this question for this sentence. So when I read, what I notice here is this comma which, right? So this comma which clause just creates a non-essential relative clause. So I know that this part isn't going to be my independent clause. This is going to be my dependent clause, right? So I don't have to, I can kind of ignore that is all. So when I read the sentence, like some historians, I'm trying to identify what the subject is, right? Because if I'm dealing with verbs, right, verbs and subjects kind of go hand in hand. So some historians I know is my subject, right? And now every grammatical sentence that's an independent clause has to have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, right? So if I say some historians claiming, right, that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, right? I do not have an independent clause. IC stands for independent clause, right? The X is no, I don't have it, right? And the reason that I don't have it, you guys, is because ing words by themselves are not verbs, right? So claiming by itself is not a verb. Claiming, right, by itself functions as an adjective, right? Or it can function as a subject of a sentence, right? Depending on the structure of that sentence, right? But by itself, it never functions like a verb. So this is where you have to kind of know that just because a word looks like a verb, it doesn't mean it acts like a verb. Let me say that again. So just because a word looks like a verb, it doesn't mean that it functions or it acts like a verb. Okay, and if you're identifying an independent clause, you have to make sure that you have a verb that actually functions as a verb in that independent clause. Otherwise, you have a sentence structure error, you have a grammatical nightmare, and you have an incorrect sentence, right? So this is what I'm looking for now, right? And the same thing, if I say having claimed, again, same thing, right? It's the ing word, right? By itself, there's no other verb before it. So if I said he was having a heart attack, that's a complete sentence, right? But it's because of the verb was, not because of the word having. Right? So remember, ing words by themselves do not function like verbs. Okay? They only become a verb when they get help from other verbs. They're called helping verbs or auxiliary verbs, right? Linking verbs, like to be or to have. Right? So if I say Jack is having a great time, it's because of the verb is that makes that a sentence, right? Not because of the word having. Okay, so I run into the same problem here. I don't have an independent clause. I just have part of a sentence, which is called a fragment. And if you only have fragments in your sentence, you don't have a grammatically correct sentence. You have a sentence structure error, right? And the same thing with to claim, right? So this is the infinitive form, right? Where you have the to, the prepositions to, with the base verb, right? To run, to be, to have, to claim, to sing, to grow, to become, so on and so forth, okay? Well, this by itself, infinitive verbs by themselves do not function as actual verbs in a sentence, right? They only function as verbs when they get help from another verb, right? So if I said, he tried to claim, right? Well, the verb in that sentence is tried, right? You could say that the entire verb phrase is he tried to claim, but I want you guys to look at it like that, right? It's because of the verb tried that makes that a sentence, not because of the words to claim, okay? So you plug that in, some historians to claim that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, again, is missing a verb. And when we miss a verb, we don't have an independent clause, okay? Because every single independent clause must always have a verb inside of it, right? Not just a word that looks like a verb, but a word that actually functions like a verb, okay? So just by looking at the verb form, and again, I'm not looking at any verb, I'm not thinking about verb tenses, I'm just looking at the form of the word, of the verb, I have my correct answer, right? And you know that it's going to be correct too, like you don't have to worry about subject-verb agreement here because that's not what this question is testing you on specifically, right? Which is, again, the benefit of being able to take this broad concept, even to go one step further, to take this very broad category called standard English conventions, which is what the language that the SAT uses, which I don't like, and to make it more narrow, right? So the specific concept is verbs, but verbs by themselves, right, is still very broad because there's different ways that the SAT can test you on verbs, right? There's different concepts for verbs that the SAT can test you on, right? So what about verbs, or in what way is the SAT testing me on? Well, they're testing me on verb forms, right? When they test you on verb forms, the context clues that you're thinking about and you're looking for is going to be different than the context clues you're looking for and thinking about when you're dealing with subject-verb agreement questions. Can you guys see that? Right? And that's really what verb form questions are. So if we take a look at another one, you guys, and again, I'm running, it's about 50, it's going to be an hour long. I was thinking this video would be 10 minutes long, but this is just me and this is how I teach. I want to try to share with you guys all of this knowledge that I have from, geez, I would say over 10,000 hours of just studying for, teaching, preparing, taking these tests. And I don't want a single person to be unsure, okay? And I know that some of the things that I say will hit for some of you guys, and other things that I say will be more meaningful to other people, right? So it's not that every single thing that I say is going to help every single one of you guys out all the time, but I'm just trying to help as many students as I can. And if I just help one student get a little bit better, to have a little bit more confidence in this video, my mission is complete, right, for this video, because that's really what I'm trying to do here, okay? So if we take a look at this next verb form question, you guys, practice test 1, modules 2, question number 21, right? If we just take a look at the answer choices, can you guys see some of the similarities we saw from the previous question, right? Like the infinitive to force and then forcing. Remember, this is actual test questions, right? This is not the stuff that I created, although you'll start to see some of that too, for those of you guys who want additional quality practice questions. But this is from the test makers. So these are like previously released questions, right? And so if this is how the SAT makes their test, and it's called a standardized exam for a reason. Standard just means it's normalized, right? So they have to test you on the same general principles and concepts of the English language, right? Each time they test you. So there's only a limited number of things they can test you on, right? And then they have to kind of make it normal or standard. So it can't look totally different from one test to another. It kind of has to look the same. So if you can start to identify the patterns or the different ways, like the different general similarities that you see in these questions, right, it'll make you a much more effective test taker. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to get you guys to notice here, right? So when I notice to force and forcing, I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going through my mental hierarchy, I don't see any sort of singular or plural verb differences, right? You can't tell. So it's not like is forcing versus are forcing or forces versus force, right? Um, so you can't really tell that. But when you jump down to not to verb tenses, right? But you go to verb forms, you can kind of see, right? Okay, they're testing me on verb forms, especially when you see the infinitive or the ing by itself. Okay, so now identifying that, it kind of frames the way that you're going to read, right? Because there's different ways to read. You can read for pleasure. You can read for understanding or comprehension, right? You can read for grammar. You can read for sentence structure, right? You can read to identify the subject of the sentence. You can read to understand the purpose of punctuation marks, right? Like commas in a sentence. So there's so many different ways that you can read, right? And so identifying the specific or the precise way that the SAT is testing you on verbs for this question will dictate or determine the way that you read, right? Which is great. So if I'm reading now for sentence structure, and if some of the context clues I'm looking for, right, is do I have an independent clause in the sentence, right, and the different components or the different parts of a sentence, then you can more confidently answer these types of questions, right? So if I read the sentence, starting with although, just to save some time, it says, although the monkeys prefer to eat vegetarian and land-dwelling invertebrates, those food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. Forces the monkeys to hunt for marine animals in any streams that have not frozen over. Okay, so one of the things that I want you guys to identify, one of the observations that I make or that I notice is the sentence structure. I know that although the monkeys prefer to eat vegetation and land-dwelling invertebrates, is a dependent clause. And I know that a comma separates a dependent clause from an independent clause, right? So those food sources is my subject. That looks like the subject of the independent clause. May become is my verb, right? May. Those food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. This is going to be my independent clause. But then you also notice another comma after the independent clause, right? And then you have this forces the monkeys to hunt for marine animals, right? So I do notice an independent clause here, right, where I do have my subject and my verb, right? Food sources is my subject and may become is my verb. And my complete thought is the food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. That's my complete thought. So that's my independent clause right over there, right? Why is that important? It's important because, like I said earlier, you guys, when you're dealing with verb form questions, you're usually dealing with sentence structure as well. Okay, and when you're dealing with sentence structure on the SAT, by the way, sentence structure is the most frequently tested grammar concept on the SAT. And it's also the concept that gives students the most trouble. So regardless of if I'm teaching beginners or people who've studied for over 2 years, sentence structure is just one of the more challenging, one of the most, if not the most challenging grammar concept for students. Maybe this and punctuation, right? Like comma rules or things like that. But that's my wheelhouse, you guys, yeah? And I can show you guys awesome ways to learn this material, to think about it, to practice it, and to master it, really. It's something that I'm kind of known for. I was nicknamed the grammar doctor in Korea by some parents. I laughed out loud, really laughed out loud when I heard it. But it was because they said that I could diagnose any student's sort of grammar illness, like their grammar sickness, in a very short period of time, as if I were a doctor, right, of that field, which is an honor and it's super funny too. But anyways, so when you're dealing with sentence structure questions on the SAT, you guys are going to be dealing with what's called sentence structure errors, right? And there's really three main categories of errors that show up on sentence structure questions for the SAT. So we won't talk about all of these in depth. I'll just kind of mention the three, and I'll tell you which category or which type these incorrect answer choices fall under. So the first sentence structure error that you're going to see is like run-on sentences, right? Run-on sentences. You also have sentence fragments, right? The ones without an independent clause. We saw that in the previous question. And then you have this third category, you guys. you have this third category of what I just call nonsensical structures. Nonsensical structures is basically just like nonsense, right? Like there's nowhere in the English language that we would write a sentence like this and consider it grammatical. Okay, that's what I mean. It's just absurd and ridiculous. And there's different types of nonsensical structures on the SAT. And we won't talk about all of those types, but one of those types is what you're going to see here. It's when we have two main verbs. What I mean by main verbs are just verbs that actually function like verbs in the sentence, right? Is when we have two main verbs that are not properly formed. Okay, so I'll give you guys an example of this. So if I had a sentence that says, Jack is smart, right? Jack is smart, comma, gets good grades. This would be an example. Let me see if I can use this eraser function pretty well. Awesome. This would be an example of a nonsense structure. Right? What I mean by that is, because it's okay to say Jack is smart as a sentence. It's okay to say Jack gets good grades as another sentence, but nowhere in the English language is it acceptable to say Jack is smart, gets good grades, right? It's just absurd. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense, right? It's nonsense. You could say Jack is smart, so he gets good grades, or you could say Jack is smart and gets good grades, right? But you cannot create a sentence that has this type of structure where we have these two main verbs, right? Like is and gets, right? Jack is smart, Jack gets good grades, right? These two main verbs are not properly formed, right? They're not properly constructed or structured, and that creates a sentence structure error. Okay, so that's one of the things that you'll have to know here, okay? Is if you notice answer choices A and D, it's going to be wrong for the same reason, right? It's that nonsense structure where we have two main verbs, right? So if I say those food sources may become unavailable, forces the monkeys to hunt, right? We have two main verbs, right? May become and forces, right? The food sources may become, right? The food sources force, right? Forces the monkeys, right? To hunt for food. So we cannot have these two main verbs that are separated by just this comma here after ice cover, right? So that would create that nonsense structure. And it's the same thing for answer choice D here as well, forced. If I say they forced the monkeys to hunt, right? That it functions as a verb, right? He forced the monkeys, right? Forced would be your verb, right? So we have the same problem. The food sources may become, right? Forced the monkeys. Again, it's like me saying Jack is smart, got good grades, right? So it creates that sentence structure error again, right? It's just nonsense is all, okay? And then the third thing that I want to teach you guys or show you guys for this question is I want you guys to get familiar, if you're not already, with this type of sentence structure. So the SAT likes to create this type of sentence structure pattern where they have an independent clause and then a comma, and then they have an ing phrase at the end. This is going to be called like a non-essential, right? This is a non-essential modifying phrase, okay? It's just not important to the main sentence, right? But we don't have to talk about non-essentials right now. We'll just take a look at this sentence structure pattern, right? So, you have a complete sentence, then a comma, and then you have that ing phrase, right? This type of sentence structure is not familiar to a lot of students, right? So not a lot of students are familiar with this type of sentence structure as being grammatically correct, but it is. Okay, so just get familiar with it now, right? And you guys will be fine. Okay, so typically when you see this general structure, when you see this sort of pattern, right, this ing phrase kind of tells you about what happened next or simultaneously to the event that occurred in the independent clause, right? So for example, if I said the bomb exploded in the city, that's my independent clause, right? The bomb exploded in the city, and I put comma, and then I say destroying everything in a 5-mile radius, right? This destroying everything in a 5-mile radius, this is that modifying phrase that kind of tells you about like kind of what happened immediately after the bomb exploded, right? So that's grammatically how this type of general sentence structure pattern works, right? Usually that's going to be the case, okay? So again, this type of structure is going to be grammatically okay, and that's going to be the correct answer for this question, right? So we have those food sources may become unavailable because of extensive snow and ice cover. Then we have the comma and then the ing phrase, right? Forcing the monkeys. So this is what kind of happens immediately after as a result, right, of the food sources becoming unavailable, right? So what happens as a result of that, right? Well, it forces the monkeys to hunt for marine animals in any streams that have not frozen over, right? So that type of general sentence structure pattern is going to be correct, which is why C is going to be the correct verb form for this question. Okay, you guys are starting to see it. Yeah, we're over an hour now, which is crazy, and I love it. Hope you guys are really finding some value from this. Now, if we go to the next way that the SAT can test you on verbs is verb tenses. So like I said, you guys, when you're thinking about verbs, when you identify a verb question, you want to think about it using that mental hierarchy, right? Think about it like a mental checklist, right? So in your mind, you're thinking, okay, I notice a verb question, go through that checklist, right? Subject, verb agreement, verb forms, and then verb tenses. Okay, so if you take a look at these answer choices for verb tenses, you'll kind of start to notice that they look kind of different, right? They look kind of different from verb forms, right? That usually have the ing by itself and like the infinitive. And then also like the subject verb agreement, where you see like a singular verb and a plural verb, right? That sort of difference. Well, here, one of the common characteristics or indicators of a verb tense question is when you have like the future tense, right? Like the will, so this future tense is a very sort of clear indication that one of the concepts you'll be tested on is verb tenses, right? And you'll also see that we don't have any sort of difference between singular and plural verbs. Like the only obvious singular verbs are was and is, right? Had can be both singular or plural depending on the context, because you can say he had or they had, right? So the verb can be singular or plural, so you don't know, it's not obvious. And then will can be both as well. So you could say he will or they will, right? So it's not obvious, right, that you have a difference between a singular and a plural verb, right? Which is why I'm not thinking about subject verb agreement yet, right? And I don't notice the ing forms or the infinitive forms, so I'm thinking verb tenses is all, okay? Now, we've been talking about context clues, right? So context clues, you guys, just for those of you guys who don't know, context just means surrounding information. Okay, so it's the words that are not, right, part of the underlined blank, right? That's the context. So that's the surrounding words that provides additional information, right, in conjunction with that underlined blank. Okay, so the SAT, on the SAT, you guys have to treat context as king. So context is king on the SAT. Remember that. Context is king. And the correct answers to every single grammar question or every single question on the SAT is going to be supported by context. So in other words, the context in the passage will always support, right, the correct answer. It's not almost always, not usually, not sometimes, right? Not rarely, not never, right? But always, every single time, right? The correct answer will be supported by context. Now, the tricky thing is you just have to be able to figure out what type of context clue is important for what type of question or what concept that the SAT is testing you on in that particular question, right? So for example, like some of the context that you're going to be looking for that's important for subject verb agreement questions is the subject of the sentence, right? The simple subject. But for verb forms, right? The context clue that you're looking for is going to be the independent clause and the different parts of the sentence, right? So you have different types of context that's important for different concepts or question types that you'll be tested on, right? But regardless though, context is king. Now, when it comes to verb tense questions, there's two types of context clues that you want to be on the lookout for, okay? You want to be on the lookout for what I call time references. Time references kind of is what it sounds like. It's a reference to time, right? So for example, if I say in 1951, right, I'm referring to the past tense, right? I could also use words, right? If I say a tomorrow, right, or 10 years from now, I'm referring to the future, right? If I say today or presently or currently, I'm referring to the present tense, right? So these time references is the first sort of major context clue that I look for, right, when I'm being tested on verb tenses, okay? Because the reference to the time is going to determine which verb tense you use, right? So if I say next week, right, you're going to use the future tense because you're going to be talking about something that hasn't happened yet, right? It's going to happen in the future, you know? If I say like last week, right, I'm going to be using the past tense, right? So the time references is something you want to be on the lookout for. And then also sometimes you want to be looking out for other verbs, okay? Not just other words that look like verbs, but other verbs that actually function like verbs. And these could be verbs in the these other verbs can be verbs in the sentence that the underlined blank is a part of, right? Or it could be other verbs in like the previous sentences or the following sentences. It just depends, okay? And you're really looking for these other verbs have to be talking about the sort of same topic that the verb in the underlined blank is referring to, right? Or is talking about as well. If they're talking about two different things, then that verb isn't going to be as helpful. That verb tense isn't going to be as helpful, right? So you do have to kind of read and understand the context. But again, we'll talk about that when we dive deeply into verb tenses in another video. But these are the two context clues, you guys. So when we read this passage, it says, in his 1963 exhibition of music, electronic television, his exposition of music, electronic television, Korean American artist Nam Jun Pak. By the way, you guys, here's another little tip. Don't focus on pronunciation. Okay, so the SAT, one of the things that I've noticed they're doing is they're writing passages with words that are hard to pronounce, right? Whether these words are very cultural words, like specific names, but from like cultures that you're not familiar with, right? Like in Uzbekistan or in Korea or, China or Japan or Africa, Egypt. And these words are going to be super hard to pronounce, right? Because they're very ethnic or cultural, and so, or you might have technical words, right? Like chromatophores, right? Or some like scientific word of an animal, right? Well, these words are extremely difficult to pronounce, right? So the tip that I give you here, guys, is don't worry about the pronunciation, So what you can do here, as long as you know that this is the artist's name, that's all that matters. You can pronounce this however you want. You can say name Jun E Pei Ik, right? Or you can say Nam Jun Pak, right? Pronunciation does not matter. You pronounce it beautifully and really prettily, they're not going to give you a point for this question, right? On the same note, if you don't pronounce it at all, right, you're not going to lose any points, right? So don't worry about pronunciation. It's something that a lot of students, especially international students who are learning English as a second language, right, kind of get tripped up on. Because when you're learning a new language, one of the things that your teachers stress is pronunciation. Even if you're a native speaker, right? Remember guys, how if you guys have ever, had this sort of classroom activity where your teacher calls on every student to read like a paragraph or like a couple of sentences in a book, right? What are they checking for? Are they checking for your comprehension? Are they checking that you're awake in class? Well, maybe sometimes, right? But what they're really checking for is they're checking to make sure that you're pronouncing the words correctly, right? So what do most students just care about? They care about how something sounds, right? Not whether they understood what was being talked about, right? So anyways, for the SAT, you guys don't care about it, right? I like to kind of just make up a name, right? Or just pronounce it like phonetically, like how I think it's pronounced. But you can also just pronounce it like the first letters, right? Like NJP, right? Or just June P, right? Something like that is going to be fine. Okay. So anyways, going back to this, it says, Nam showed how television images can be manipulated to express an artist's perspective. Okay. Today, that's my time reference clue. Can you guys see that? And this is my time reference clue. So when I'm saying today, I'm referring to the present tense, right? So that's what I observe, but I'm not solving the question until I read the end of the sentence, right? That's just a good sort of habit to get into. So P will be considered the first video artist. Okay, read to the end of the sentence, you guys. Make sure that you do, right? Now, again, because you know you're being tested on verb tenses now, right? You can look for those context clues. Right, looking at the context clue today, we're referring to the present tense. I know that I'm gonna want to have, I know that the future tense doesn't work. I know that the past tense doesn't work. And I know that the past perfect doesn't work as well, right? So you want to make sure to use the correct tense based off of that time reference. So if you're talking about stuff that's happening today, right, you're using the present tense, right, most of the time. So in this case, you want to say today, P is considered, right? He is considered the first video artist. It wouldn't make any logical sense to say today he was considered, because you're like, what? Because it's happened today, right? So shouldn't you use a present tense verb? And then you say today he will be considered. In this context, doesn't make any sense. Because when you say today he will be considered the first video artist, like he's going to get some sort of award or presentation on TV that's going to grant him the first video artist award. It's kind of weird, right? Doesn't make logical sense to say, right? So you know that the answer choice that's going to be the most logical based off of the context clues, right, is going to be the present tense is all. Okay? And same thing with this other verb tense question as well. So let's have you guys kind of go through this, right? We'll test you guys out here. We'll do a little bit of training in real time over video. So the first thing, you guys, is take a glance at the answer choices, right? Can you notice what you're being tested on here? And how do you know? When you see this future tense, right? And again, it doesn't look like subject-verb agreement. You don't see singular or plural verbs that are obvious, right? You only have two obvious singular verbs, right? Has and doubles. These are the only two obvious singular verbs. The other ones, had and will, can be both, right? We talked about that already. So, you know, you're thinking in your mind, you're thinking, okay, verb tenses, right? And so when you think about verb tenses, what are the context clues you're focused on? You're focused on time references, right, as well as other verbs, right? So that's what you'll look for here. So this passage says, formed in 1967 to foster political and economic stability within the Asia-Pacific region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was originally made up of 5 members: Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Okay, notice how formed in 1967 is that referring to that past tense, which is why we have the past tense verb here was, right? We have a new sentence here. It says, by the end of the 1990s, the organization has doubled its membership. Okay, so noticing, so guys, write this down or just make a mental note of it, right? But this is important. You know, the present tense, the past tense, and the future tense, those verb tenses are pretty straightforward, right? And most students know when to use them. But students have trouble with the present perfect and the past perfect tenses, right? And these are the two. So there are 11 verb tenses in the English language, but like I said, you only really need to know 5, right? You need to know 5 really well. The 5 that you have to know really well, right, is present tense, past tense, future tense, present perfect, and past perfect, right? And you have to know precisely when and how to use them, right? So there's different uses, right, for each tense, and you want to make sure that you have a very firm understanding of each of the ways that these verb tenses are going to be used, right? So we don't have time to talk about that in this video, but it's just something to keep track of. If you want to kind of self-study, right, how to use present perfect and past perfect, it'd be an excellent idea because these two verb tenses are very common as answer choices on the SAT when they're testing you on verb tenses. Okay, so keep that in mind. So when I read this sentence, you guys, and the observation that I make is I notice the time reference clue by the end of the 1990s. This is my time reference clue. Okay, now how this type of phrase works, you guys, when I say by the end of the 1990s, if I had a timeline here, and this point here is the present, this is now. So here, this is, let's just say this is the 1990s, okay? So when I say by the 1990s, what I'm saying is before the 1990s, leading up to the 1990s, and then stopping right at the end of the 1990s. So it stops here. So it does not continue into the present. Okay? So when you have a phrase that says by the end of the 1990s, or if you say like by the time I graduated, or by my 30th birthday, right? You're really talking about events that happened in the past. Okay? So knowing that, we know that we can get rid of the present tense doubles, and then the future tense will double, right? Now, here, the present perfect and the past perfect, right? So has doubled is the present perfect and had doubled is the past perfect. So this is where your understanding of how to use these verb tenses precisely is going to help you tremendously, right? For questions like this. So when you have the past perfect tense, I'll just talk about it briefly here. Past perfect tense is used to indicate that a past event, right? That a past event occurred or happened before another past event or a past point in time, right? A past point in time, right? So this might be kind of hard to kind of understand or grasp, right? But basically we have two events that occurred in the past, right? And the past perfect tense is given to the event that occurred before, right, the other event. So it's the event that occurred first that takes on the past perfect tense. Okay, so if I give you guys a basic example of this, if I say, and I'll write it in this little corner here where I have some space. If I say, the plane left before I arrived at the airport. Okay, so here we have two events that occurred in the past, right? The plane leaving is one event, and you arriving at the airport is the other event. Okay, so like I said, the past perfect tense is given to the event that occurred first, or that occurred before the other event, right? So which event would that be? Which event occurred first, you guys? The plane leaving or my arriving at the airport? Well, you would say, right, the plane leaving, because the plane left before you arrived. So the plane was gone by the time you got to the airport, right? So we know that this is the first event, right? And because the plane left is your first event, you could write this verb left as the past perfect, right? So you could say the plane had left, right? Or the plane had gone, or the plane had taken off, right? Before I arrived, right? That's how the present or the past perfect is used, okay? And that's kind of what you see here. It's just that in this sentence, we don't have two past events, but we have an event that occurred before a past point in time. So when I say by the end of the 1990s, it's saying that before the 1990s, right, and leading up to the 1990s, right, the organization had doubled its initial membership. So this doubling of the initial membership, this event occurred, right? Before the 1990s, right? So maybe it increased, maybe the initial membership increased a little bit here, like in 1972, increased a little bit more here in 1980, and then a little bit more here, here, and here. And it's saying that by the end of the 1990s, right? By the end of the 90s, right? So before the 2000, so by this point, right, the membership doubled. Okay, so this event of doubling the membership, this thing occurred before this past point in time, right? So that's why we want to use the past perfect here, had doubled, as opposed to the present perfect. Can you guys see that? Okay, cool. But that's verb tenses, you guys, in a nutshell. Okay, so cool. So we talked about it. So we talked about the 3 different ways that the SAT can test you on verbs, right? We have subject-verb agreement, we have verb forms, and then we have verb tenses. And remember, the important things here, you want to think about these verbs as a mental hierarchy, right? So when you look over the answer choices and you ask yourself, okay, you know it's testing you on verbs, you want to go through that checklist in that order, right? Subject, verb agreement, right? Verb forms, and then verb tenses. And each concept, right? Each specific concept of verbs, you're looking for different things in your answer choices, right? So you're looking for singular versus plural verbs, right? If you notice one difference between answer choices, where one is singular and the other is a plural verb, then you know that subject-verb agreement is one of the things you're being tested on, right? If you notice the ing or the infinitive to, right, to verb, then you know that, oh, maybe they're testing me on verb forms, right? And then if you notice like the future tense, right, or the past perfect and the present perfect, right, especially the future tense, right, you know that maybe they're testing you on verb tenses. Okay, so that's how you kind of like work through these questions. And that is, you guys, in an hour and 30 minutes, this is much more than a foundational understanding. This is going a little bit more advanced, and I didn't plan to do it like that. I wanted to keep it more basic, but just couldn't help myself. I want to make sure that each of you guys has a very thorough understanding of this stuff. And I also, because this is the first video that I'm releasing that's in this form, I wanted to kind of build or start to gain a little bit of your trust. You know, I can stand here and tell you guys all day that, look, guys, I've done this for so long and I've gotten a perfect score, and just trust me, believe me, believe me. You know, instead of all of that show and go, which I don't like to do, but I know some of it is necessary. It's just better if I just show you how sincere and passionate and knowledgeable I am about this stuff. And so I just decided to override what I wanted to do initially and just go a lot more in depth. But at the same time, you guys, I am going to come out with future videos, right, that dive into each of these different ways that the SAT tests you on verbs as separate videos. So you'll see the subject-verb agreement stuff next. And it'll go much more in detail. So it'll be a great sort of continuation for those of you who have trouble with verbs, because now that you have a very rock solid foundation, we can start to build on that foundation, right, with more advanced stuff. And plus, you guys, it always helps to hear me say things again, right? Don't just have the mindset of, but I heard that already, or I know that already, or you said that already, right? Well, think about it like this. How many times do you have to be told to do something before you actually do something, right? And on the actual test, when you're under time pressure like that, right? Hey, you want things to be automatic, right? You want to have the sort of confidence to not just, you know, kind of have an idea of what you're doing, but you want to have the confidence to be like, I know exactly what to do here, and then just go on, just run that program, right? With all the sort of training and the things that you heard me kind of talk about. Okay, so it'll be a great continuation for you guys there to build on that foundation that you guys all have now. So guys, again, if you have any questions or comments, or you're confused about something or want me to clarify something, then write that in the comment section below. I will read all of those and will respond to you guys either in the comment section, or I will make a video of your question if a lot of you guys have the sort of same question, right? Again, My goal for you guys is to help you get fewer than 5 wrong consistently on the verbal sections of the digital SAT, so that you guys experience that sort of taste of that top tier score, right? Because I know all of you guys can do it. It does take some time. It does take some effort and patience on your part. It does take a lot of self-studying, a lot of internalizing and processing on your end, because I'll do everything on my end to help you guys out. Okay, so this is Jin Teacher, you guys, signing off. Remember, oh, I should do this. It's pretty much a full class. So at the end of every class, you guys, what I love to do, what I make sure to do is I make sure to ask every student uh, what's one thing they learned in class. I want to ask you guys the same thing. So take some time right now to think about what is one thing that you learned from today's lesson. That one thing could be something brand new that you didn't know before that was meaningful or important for you, right? Or it could be something that you kind of knew before, but now you know better because of this video, right? Take your time, write that one thing down, or write it in the comment section below. And even just say it out loud right now. Because there is something magical about taking what's in your head and putting it out there, right? Either in spoken or in written form. Because honestly, we all have so many things that we think about, right? Simultaneously. Like there's some of you guys are thinking, what's for dinner? Some of you guys are thinking, when's it going to end? Some of you guys are thinking, man, like, this is cool, or man, this is kind of cool, but not so cool, right? It took so long. Man, his handwriting is bad. And you guys have a lot of different thoughts in your mind. And if you add just one more silent thought, right, of what you learned, but you don't put it out there in the universe, right? You don't write it down or you don't say it out loud, it won't stick as well. Right? And this forces you to take what's in your head, what you think you know, and then put it out there so that you really practice, showing that you know. And the more that you do that, the clearer that your thinking is going to get, right? The more organized your thinking is going to get, and the better you'll be able to articulate or explain, right, this stuff. So the way when you hear me talking about this stuff, it comes out very naturally, but it's because I've practiced, right, it a lot of times, and it'll be the same thing for you too, which is why I do this for you guys or with you guys. So what is one thing new that you learned, or what is one thing that you learned a little bit better, right? And something that's really meaningful or important for you. One last thing before I go, you guys, is do not try to learn everything. Should have said this at the beginning of the lesson, not at the end. But don't try to remember everything that I talked about. If you try to remember everything, you're going to remember nothing. So instead of trying to remember everything, just try to focus on one or two sort of main things that were important for you. That's the key, right? Because what's important for John is going to be may not necessarily be important for Sarah. Right? What's important for Sarah might not be necessarily important for Justin, and so on and so forth. And even if they are the same, they might be important for different reasons or in different ways, right? So that's how you want to approach it, is just learn one thing at a time. And I promise you guys, right, just if you stick with me, watch these videos daily, your knowledge will start to stack, and you'll start to like feel more confident. You'll start to think more clearly, more of an organized way. Basically, I'm trying to take everything that's in my head and then transfer it over to your guys' minds, right? So that you guys are thinking like me. You're thinking like a top 1%er, right, when you're taking these tests. And just with more practice and that belief and that effort, right? Play full out when I'm doing this stuff, you guys. That's why I'm kind of animated, and I'm trying to, if you guys actually see me in the video, which you might at this point, is depending on what my editor does, you're going to see me get all animated, right? It's really, I try to do that, right, to make sure that you guys are more engaged too. Okay, so I appreciate all of you guys. Thank you guys for bearing with me for 90 minutes. Thank you guys for giving me your attention. That's the most important thing of all. And I really appreciate your time and your attention, you guys. So until next time, you guys, make sure to always stay curious, always keep learning, and make sure to make this knowledge yours. Take care, you guys.